At one point, close to a third of everyone in England lived on a council estate, not a small pocket of the country, not a fringe experience, a third. If you grew up on one in the 80s or 90s, you were never the exception. You were the majority, living out something that looked almost identical from Newcastle to Plymouth. A game of rounders in the middle of the road, using a lamppost as first base and someone's coat as second. A mum leaning out of an upstairs window, shouting a name that isn't quite loud enough to be heard over the shouting below. A dog barking behind a fence. An older brother's radio balanced on a windowsill, playing quietly to nobody in particular. Nobody was rich here. Nobody was thinking about that either. This was what a childhood looked like on hundreds of estates across the country. And if you were one of that third, you already know exactly the warmth in that memory. Say, council estate today, and people hear something loaded. Back then it was just home, alongside everyone else you knew, on a street that looked almost identical to the one 2 roads over. Rows of houses or low blocks built close together, a patch of green, worn bald from years of football, a corner shop within walking distance that sold everything a child could want for under £1. From penny sweets to a can of pop to a scratch card nobody's mum knew they'd bought. Money was often tight and nobody pretended otherwise. But tight money and a happy childhood turned out to have almost nothing to do with each other. A garden shared a fence with the next one along, and that fence was more of a suggestion than a boundary, low enough to lean over for a chat or hand something across without ever using a gate. Kids moved freely between houses all day, in and out of whoever's door happened to be open, fed lunch by whichever mother was closest. When hunger struck, usually something on toast eaten standing at a kitchen counter that wasn't even your own. Nobody on the street was a stranger, and that alone made the whole place feel like it belonged to you. If there's one memory that captures the whole spirit of the era, it's being sent next door by your mum with a cup in your hand, asking to borrow a bit of sugar or milk or a couple of eggs until the next shop. It happened constantly, in both directions, and nobody ever really kept score of who owed who. You'd knock, ask the question you'd been told word for word, and stand on the step while the neighbour disappeared back into her own kitchen to sort it out, usually coming back with a bit more than you'd actually asked for. Doors were left unlocked more often than not. A neighbour would let themselves halfway into the hallway just to shout up the stairs rather than knock and wait, and nobody thought anything of it. Kids were sent on errands between houses, trusted completely to make it there and back without anyone worrying, sometimes carrying a note, sometimes just carrying a message in their head that got slightly garbled by the time it arrived. It created a kind of everyday familiarity that's hard to describe to anyone who didn't live it. Everyone on the street knew your name, knew your mum and dad, and would just as happily tell you off for something as your own parents would, without anyone thinking that was strange at all. A telling off from next door's mum carried exactly the same weight as one from your own, and you knew better than to argue with either. Ask anyone who grew up on an estate in this era about their summer holidays and you'll get the same answer almost every time. They felt endless, 6 weeks stretched out into something with barely any structure at all. Just one long, warm blur of being outside from breakfast until the streetlights came on, with lunch happening wherever you happened to be standing when someone's mum called everyone in. There was no real itinerary to a day. You went outside because that's what happened after breakfast, and you found whichever friends were already out. And the day built itself from there without anyone planning a single moment of it. Bikes got ridden until the chain came off, then dragged home to be fixed with whatever tools happened to be in the shed. Games got invented on the spot using nothing but a tennis ball and whatever wall happened to be nearby, rules changing depending on who turned up and whose garden was available that afternoon. Some streets managed an organised trip once a year, the whole road pooling together for a coach to a seaside town or a theme park, a single golden day that everyone talked about for weeks afterward. Looking back now, the specific details blur together, one long golden stretch of a summer that somehow lasted for years rather than weeks, even though it was really only ever 6. Every street had its own quiet parade of ordinary cars, and looking back at them now feels like looking at a specific kind of family photograph. A Ford Cortina or Escort, a Vauxhall Cavalier, an Austin Metro, boxy and small, parked at an angle because the space out front was never quite big enough. Somebody a few doors down always had something slightly flashier, and everyone knew exactly whose it was without ever needing to ask. What was parked on your street? A Cortina, a Cavalier, or something that never started first time in winter? Nobody's car was flash, and nobody expected it to be. A car on the drive meant a family was getting by, which was exactly the same thing every other family on the street was doing too. Washing it on a Sunday morning was practically a ritual. A bucket of soapy water and a chamois leather. The whole street smelling faintly of car shampoo for an hour while the radio played through an open window and somebody's dad argued with the sponge about a particularly stubborn patch of bird mess on the bonnet. The car itself hardly mattered. The routine was the point. The small, unremarkable Sunday comfort of it. The same scene repeating up and down the street at roughly the same time every single week. There's a specific kind of closeness that comes from living somewhere everybody genuinely knows everybody else. And on an estate like this, that closeness went right down to knowing more about your neighbours than you probably had any real right to. Whose washing was still out when it started raining? Who'd had a new telly delivered? Who was courting who further down the street and whether it was likely to last? At the time, all of that felt like belonging. A place where somebody would notice if your curtains hadn't opened by mid-morning and would knock to check you were all right rather than simply walking past. A place where the entire street somehow knew a birthday was coming up before the family had even mentioned it themselves. And a place where bad news traveled fast because so many people cared enough to want to know. Word of an illness or a job lost would reach the whole street within a day, usually followed within hours by someone turning up with a casserole dish they didn't want back. Gossip is the wrong word for it. A community that watched out for its own as naturally as breathing. Every estate ran on its own unwritten rulebook of games that needed nothing more than a street and a handful of kids to play. 40-40 played around whatever patch of wall or lamppost counted as home that week. Knockdown Ginger, which involved knocking on a stranger's door and sprinting away before it opened, guaranteed to end in at least one telling off a summer. British Bulldog played across a patch of green until somebody's knee was grazed, and the game paused just long enough for a plaster before starting straight back up again. The corner shop sat at the center of almost everything. A quarter of cola bottles or a handful of penny sweets chosen one at a time from a jar, counted out carefully by a shopkeeper who knew every child on the estate by name and exactly how much they had to spend before they'd even reach the counter. A can of pop shared between 3 kids using straws sat on the wall outside because going any further than that felt like it defeated the purpose of buying it there in the first place. For a lot of children, the walk to that shop and back was the first bit of genuine independence they were ever given. And it felt like an entire adventure, even though it was only ever a few hundred yards. None of it was polished, and none of it needed to be. A council estate in the 80s and 90s ran on borrowed sugar, unlocked doors, and summers that felt like they'd never end. And for the people who grew up right in the middle of it, that was more than enough. Nobody was waiting for something better to come along, because nothing about it ever felt like it was missing in the first place. If you grew up exactly this way, you already know there was nothing missing from it at all. I know I don't feel like I've missed anything. I loved every minute spent on my council estate as a kid, and it's some of the fondest memories I've got. For me, it felt safe, it felt peaceful, and most importantly, it felt like home. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time.